I'm Andrew Hayward. I am the culture editor at Decrypt. Web3 is scary right now, right? You know, there's hacks, there's exploits, all my apes gone. You've heard all this stuff before. Luckily, have a couple experts here on legal and security, respectively, that can give some insight into best practices and how brands and creators are thinking about this, and maybe, hopefully, what the future will look like. So why don't we go down the line, introduce yourselves.
Hey, I'm Anshuman. I work with Protocol Labs on their partnerships team. We are behind IPFS, NFT.storage. We work a lot with NFT creators and large projects. So excited to be here.
Name's Teddy Ellison, previously an associate at Latham & Watkins, met Amanda Cassett when she was forming Serotonin, helped her form that entity, and then beyond that, helped her spin out two technology businesses. One is Mojito, which is an NFT minting platform, but that is not all we do. We're kind of a full service. We provide consulting services, and we help you with your drops beyond just the primary. We can do auctions and everything else. And then I also work with Franklin as an advisor, which Franklin is a crypto payroll tool. And yeah, that's sort of my background.
Great, thank you so much. So why don't we sort of start high level? What is the state of play right now when it comes to security and the legal considerations around that in Web3? And you know, how are brands and creators thinking about it as they're approaching the space?
Yeah, I think security, it's like many things, is multifaceted. And so there's the actual technical security of, you know, how do you secure the data that you're enshrining on the chain? But there's also security around your copyright, around your licensing rights, and that's very important to enterprise brands. Like if Nike drops a bunch of sneakers on chain, they don't want impersonators taking that or similar things. So with security, there's a movement towards auditing, like from a technical perspective, auditing what the NFT actually is. So there's the hash on chain, which is just a pointer. That's a pointer to some data. It's really important where that data is. Is that on an Amazon server that's being paid for by the creator who may stop paying their bill, or some other centralized service? And so there's more vigilance around where the actual data sits, and when you quote unquote own it, do you actually own the data? And so I've seen a lot more awareness in like NFT creator land as well for, hey, where are we storing our assets, and using that as sort of a marketing point as well of we store this on Arweave or we store this on IPFS, and it can be shared in a indisputable, verifiable format.
Yeah, and to go off that a little bit, I kind of think about it in two ways, right? So there is the company side where you're protecting your brand's NFT, and then there's the individual side. Obviously, I have more experience with the company side. So at the Mojito level and as well at Serotonin, when we advise NFT projects, you talk about what do you need, what is the infrastructure you need to make sure that your NFTs are safe and that you're moving forward and that you can trust our platform. So at Mojito, we have two offerings, right? So one is where we work with brands and they are the merchants and they are selling their NFTs to end users. And then we have a separate model, which is much riskier, but that's where this comes in, is you take a merchant of record offering and you take on all that liability, obviously for a cost, and you sell the NFTs on behalf. You kind of step into the shoes of the users through a licensing agreement that we agree to. So when we are doing that, obviously we are worried about chargebacks, fraud, KYT, KYC. So I'm not an expert in that. I'm a corporate lawyer by trade, so regulatory stuff, I need help. So we work with some of the best vendors in the industry. Sardine, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is a phenomenal fraud provider. Onfido does the KYC for us. Chainalysis does the KYT, where you're checking all the wallets. And we work closely with them and make sure that we're setting up the boundaries correctly to protect our brands. And since we are working with like the Sotheby's and the CIAs of the world, they are particularly worried about our security program. They work with our CISO very closely. And in addition to that, obviously, you have to worry about what your insurance coverage is, which insurance can be very difficult in this space. So I've been working with insurance providers much longer than I ever would have wanted to. talking about E&O insurance and cyber, and they're very reluctant to insure the space. So you have to work with them very closely and explain what you're doing and back up your security practices, talk about what your SOC compliance looks like. So that's kind of what we think about when we're thinking about protecting our brands.
Nice. So when it comes to security, even some of the people and companies that we expect to be really on top of things have been affected by hacks and exploits at times. But even so, there are best practices that I'm sure that you guys prescribe to companies and, even with collectors in mind. So why don't we do kind of a quick overview of what are the best practices, the best preventative measures for protecting your NFTs, protecting your, NFT startups?
Yeah, I think it depends on if you're sort of the creator of the NFT versus the collector. From a creator side, we obviously advise, self-custody as with anything in this space. However, that comes with a ton of caveats. When you set up a traditional business with a warehouse and equipment, you hire a security guard, you probably set up CCTV cameras. You need to do the similar thing. A lot of folks come into the space, use a minting service, done, end of story. You got to think forward of what if that service fails? I don't have the keys. Do you actually own the thing? And so we sort of advise basic education before even getting into the minting space.
I was going to say, we just saw something like that with FTX a few months ago, where companies like Coachella and Tomorrowland had minted NFTs through their service, and then all of a sudden, they don't work anymore.
Yeah.
What happens?
Right, exactly. And now the creator themselves don't own their own NFTs, right? They can't run the minting function. So that's a really important one. I think secondly, for collectors, like I said, it's important to know where the NFTs are. And for very large value NFTs, there's a lot of, when we talk about security around IP, there's a lot of things that come around licensing and things like that. For example, I think there was something called Sandow or something, who bought some illustrated, very rare copy of Dune, the book, and thought they could make a movie or their own off-Broadway type of movie. Turns out they can't, because when you buy an NFT, you don't buy the license from the owner. They didn't realize that, and unfortunately only did when their lawyers told them after they had paid the money. So there's a lot of things there around cool, I'm buying the hash on the chain, but what are the commercial licenses around it? What are the copyrights around it? Bored Ape Yacht Club, another example, they say you own it completely and can use it for commercial use, but you don't actually have the commercial license, because you can't create new Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs when you buy one, right? So there's a lot of due diligence that goes into even securing IP when you're paying large amounts for these things.
Yeah, 100% agree. And from the creator and company standpoint, the license is crucial, right? It depends how it's drafted. And like you said, Bored Ape Yacht Club, which we all saw the Seth Green debacle, and where they licensed out an ability to sell the creative work. And then he went ahead, made a show, had it ready to go, and then it was stolen. And then the question was at that point, right, who owns that IP? That license was written in a very specific way to say that whoever holds the NFT has the license. You take that to court, maybe that doesn't stand up. But in the meantime, that's what the license says. And that's why he was so aggressive in getting it back, eventually did get it back at a cost to him. But the licensing in these NFTs is absolutely crucial. And you have to think about how you're drafting it, what it means down the line when these things are sold on secondary marketplaces, who owns it, who has the rights. And I don't think anyone quite knows what will stand up, right? So if you write an NFT contract and you say who owns it has the rights, and it's transferred to XYZ people, and then you still have the creator who created the content, and under common law, that would be the IP right holder, right? So do these NFTs continue to carry that along, and we'll find out in good time. But absolutely agree that you got to worry about the licensing. And when you're dealing with sort of these transfers and protecting it on chain, you are obviously worried about the anonymity of everything that's out there, whether or not you can even figure out who holds it. We've seen success, we've seen failure in the legal markets related to that. But yeah, I'll stop.
And so, in your experience, how have you seen a difference between more Web3 native firms that are considering these questions and, traditional brands that are coming into the space for the first time, and it's, you know, a totally new experience for them? What are the differences in how they're looking at it and thinking about it?
Yeah, I think from a traditional standpoint, they're looking at it as a way of engaging community, and that's like number one. And then the second is brand protection. They don't want it to hurt their traditional brand. As part of that, the majority of cases I've seen is where big brands partner with firms who are specialized in NFT drops. I mean, Nike partners deeply with RT, FKT, and who work on Polygon. And that sort of offsets, one, it keeps a good separation between the two, probably for legal purposes. And also from a technical standpoint, it's not like employees at Nike need to learn the ropes and like do all of this, right? Their proficiency is building sneakers and marketing them, and they see this as an extension. So, and I think that makes sense. It's not a core part of the business yet, but that makes sense as a way for brands.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I love this. So we work with a lot of Web 2 and Web 3 brands, and we see vast differences on how they approach everything, right? So you get a Web 3 brand, and they aren't even, there's exceptions, but for the most part, they're not worried too much about what's going on the legal side. They just want to get live. And they want you to support that and get them on, and you got to kind of help guide them to make sure they're not making mistakes along that process, because they're not thinking 1, 2, 3 years down the road. And then we work with these Web 2 brands, and it is a very difficult process where you're dealing with them for 5, 6, 7 months. You have to go through their security protocol, you got to go through their legal, they have to understand what you're doing, and they are going to protect the hell out of their stuff. And if there's any ambiguity there, they are going to tell us, and we're going to work on that, which is great for me as a corporate lawyer by trade who's helping get these people live. I'm doing my best. We have Latham on our back, but at the end of the day, I'm not perfect. So I love these legal counsels picking apart the licenses, picking apart our contracts, and telling us what they need to do to protect their stuff, and going through their security protocols, getting us SOC compliant. Those things are crucial, and it's wildly different, right? Like, so if you're dealing with a Sotheby's or CAA or you name it, they're going to put you through the ringer. You're dealing with a Web3 protocol, they're going to trust your input. And that's kind of the balance there. And I think we have an advantage there because we have that input from the traditional brands who really have that backing, and then we can push that on to our Web3 users. So.
And so in the sort of unfortunate instance of a hack, a theft, something stops working unexpectedly, you know, how are you sort of advising brands and creators to deal with that? Like, what are the options that they have in front of them to contend with these kind of unexpected Web3 happenings?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, at least I've seen, right? Takedowns and copyright infringement suits are typically the go-to that I've seen. But the first is trying to protect yourself on the major marketplaces. The side effect of a blockchain is everything is there forever. It is immutable as long as the underlying nodes exist. And so if something is transferred or stolen, you can't, take it back, technically speaking. But what you can do is on all the major marketplaces exposed to users, OpenSea, Rarible, et cetera, they do offer endpoints and support for resolving some of these issues. So if you raise it, hey, there's an impersonation here, or there was a hack, they can take it down and vastly reduce the chances of follow-on transfers where things start going off the rails.
Yeah, it's tough, right? And we've seen limited success with the 2016-2017 Bitcoin case where you saw the DOJ collect back a ton of funds for someone. But beyond that, we have not seen a ton of success at getting those back. So from at least a company standpoint, what you do is you insure yourself, you make sure that you have that backing. Obviously, you want your smart contracts audited, make sure everything's tight, bound. But at the end of the day, if something is gone, chances you're going to get it back are slim, and if you do get it back, it's going to cost you a ton of resources, a ton of cost. So what you need to do is try and get this insurance market to back the NFT creators, the NFT companies, to protect them against those issues, whether it be a smart contract malfunction or whether it be a phishing attack. Those are the kind of things you need, and you need as much protection as you can in the market.
I'd love to get into a couple case studies, sort of breaking down prominent examples, things that have happened, what they did or tried to do to contend with it. Teddy, I know that you had a couple in mind. Do you want to raise one?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about a couple with the Bitcoin case, and but one that I don't think I've talked about at all that I love, I think is interesting, is the Magic the Gathering situation where you had, the Magic company has created all these cards that they were trading freely, and it was a great opportunity for a Web3 enthusiast to come in and say, hey, I can fix this, right? I can tell you, you have a limited supply. It's going to cost a certain amount. That was a big pitch for Magic the Gathering when they came out with the card game. But at the end of the day, you don't have the license to do that. They've pitched it hard. I don't know if there's a resolution or not, to be honest. But at the end of the day, those kind of arguments and fights are fun to watch from our community, for real. And it's a very well-known card brand. I think everyone's heard of Magic the Gathering, whether you played it or not. And to see that, play out on the public stage and talk about whether or not those Web3 licenses can get by when you're kind of piggybacking off someone else's IP is interesting to find out. And I mean, I won't say where I side on that, but it's a fun case. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, my favorite case is, I think, from 2021. It's almost banal in its stupidity, but it was by a user called NathanConfirm, who was basically an NFT skeptic and listed a bunch of his art as NFTs on OpenSea. Folks bought it. I think the total collection went for over $1 million. A few weeks after, he then rug pulled all his users by literally changing the images of his art to images of rugs. And he could do that. And it happened on OpenSea, and OpenSea couldn't do anything about it. And it was his way of demonstrating, you can own the pointer to the data, but if you don't own the data or you don't replicate it, you don't. You don't own any of the IP, and you definitely don't own the data. And so that was a big wake-up call for folks to understand, hey, if this pointer is aws.s3.whatever, that's a warning flag that someone else is paying for this, and someone else actually owns this data.
That's sort of a different example, but similar result. But just this week, the creators of Goblin Town changed the artwork for their NFTs. And now all of them show an animated middle finger with 3 smaller middle fingers being depicted. And it's sort of like a statement on royalties, to push back to the marketplaces and the community that would, not fully honor royalties. And they're going to move to a new smart contract, and everyone is eventually going to get airdropped an identical version of the original NFT. But it does show that, there may be somebody who controls the actual art, the actual data that's tied to your NFT, and you may not have any control over that. I wanted to sort of wrap up here and ask, what does the future outlook look like for brands and creators in this space when it comes to ensuring that they are as secure as possible and the sort of legal considerations that come along with that?
Yeah, from a security standpoint, I think we're seeing a lot more self-custody, but also solutions around self-custody that make it easier to manage keys. It's not an ideal situation to have to print out a 24 secret key and store it in your parents' house, but that's just the reality we're in. But there are a lot of services that make this easier and make it clear. There are a lot of services that also allow for actually transferring the data and making it clear where it is, whether it's IPFS or Arweave or anything like that, with actual transaction hashes and immutability inherent.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of things that happen, right? So I think one thing is you're going to get more guidance from the government and the legal system via cases and people actually litigating these things, which we don't have a lot of right now, as we all know. And then you're going to see people partnering with brands, so you're going to see brands building in-house, right? So you're going to see a lot of brands that already have the money, the know-how. They're going to say, I'm not going to trust anyone else with this. We're going to do it by our rules, and we're going to build it. And then you're going to see people that trust the Chainalysis, the Sardines of the world, which I think is a good model, where you go out and you find the people who have been doing this work for the last 2 years, who have been protecting their assets and thinking about their companies, providing that solution to eventually build you up to a position where you can go on your own and live in this environment. Obviously, most of these Web2 brands don't have that knowledge, the know-how, or even any care to do it, or any money to do it. So I do think we're going to see a lot of partnerships, a lot of movement in the space, if it keeps going in this direction, to protect the end user ultimately. And that is crucial for the brand, right? Because if the end users are screwed, that's not good for PR, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. All right, great chat, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.